The MMA Math Prediction model is sitting at 6-0, and we are now just one win away from matching Bo Nickal's record. Maybe Bo's next matchup should be up against the MMA Math model. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, this weekend the model has its toughest prediction for the fight night between Peter Yan and Davison Figueiredo, so make sure to check out that video if you haven't already. In this episode, however, we'll be looking at the final pay-per-view of the year, UFC 310, with the severely underrated main event of Alexandre Pantoja vs Kai Asakura. Now, to avoid being overly clickbaity, there is just no way we can do our typical MMA math breakdown for Pantoja vs Asakura, simply due to Asakura having no fights in the UFC and the general lack of cross-pollution between the UFC and other organizations. But not to shy away, we can do a quick and dirty prediction. I'm not going to count this on the official record because it won't be using the model, but it's still worth talking about at the end of this video. However, to make up for this, we'll be looking at both the co-main event in Shavkat vs Ian Machado Garry and the heavyweight matchup between Ciryl Gane and Alexander Volkov. Before we get started, I wanted to thank everyone for their suggestions on how to improve the model. The best ones have been noted, and I'm always searching for more suggestions. At this stage, I'm just kinda waiting for the model to make a wrong prediction first before implementing. That's really the best way to find out what's wrong with it, so we can take a look and troubleshoot just a bit more accurately. So at this stage, we are still using V2 of the model. Without further ado, here are the rules for the MMA Math Prediction model. We are going to look at a fighter's last 5 fights. A fighter will get points for every victory relative to their opponent's UFC ranking at the time. Beating a champion will get you 16 points. Beating ranked 1 will get you 15, beating ranked 2, 14, and so forth. Losing a fight nets you -2 points, and getting finished nets you -3. You'll also lose points if you're on a streak of losses correlative to the number of losses in that streak. You get an extra 5 points if you beat someone who your opponent has lost to. If your opponent avenged that loss, you only get 1 point. You gain an extra 5 points if you have already beat your opponent, capped at 10 points. You get an extra 5 points for a KO, TKO, or submission, and extra points for a streak of finishes correlative to the length of the streak. For example, if you had a 3-fight win and finish streak, you will get 15 points base for these finishes, and an extra 3 points for the length of the streak, making 18 points. Doctor stoppages will be judged on a case-by-case basis, and an extra 5 points if 2 or more judges give you every round in a decision victory. If you are over 35, you lose 5 points and an extra point on top of that for each year older than 35 you are. If you are undefeated in the UFC, you gain an extra 5 points. If you have a UFC loss but are undefeated in your last 5, you get 3 points. For the fight we are predicting, if you are fighting in your country of origin and your opponent is not from that same country, an extra 5 points. This does not apply to the United States and their fighters. Starting with the heavyweight matchup, which I feel is flying slightly under the radar due to all the other logistical drama on this card, as well as being pushed back from UFC 308, but we have former interim heavyweight champion Ciryl Gane up against perennial contender Alexander Volkov in a rematch of their 2021 main event. Starting with the number 3 ranked Alexander Volkov, who has been my personal dark horse of the heavyweight division since his KO of Fabricio Werdum. Definitely a fighter with huge potential, but just doesn't seem to be able to put it together in the big fights. In any case, Volkov will lose 6 points straight off the bat as the big guy is now 36. 5 fights ago takes us to the 19th of March 2022 for the main event of UFC Fight Night Volkov vs Aspinall, where a now number 5 ranked Volkov would be put up against number 10 ranked Tom Aspinall. As a slight favourite and on home turf, Aspinall would put in what is in my opinion his breakout performance, dominating the entire fight by piecing Volkov up on the feet, easily securing a takedown and submitting him with an arm lock just 3 minutes and 45 seconds into the first. Unfortunately, losing 3 points for Volkov. 4 fights ago takes us to the 4th of June 2022 for the main event of UFC Fight Night Volkov vs Rozenstruik, where now ranked 7th Volkov will be put up against number 8 ranked Jairzinho Rozenstruik, in a fight that either could have been a 25-minute heavyweight point fight or a swang and bang one-rounder. Luckily for fight fans, we got the latter. Rozenstruik would come out early with some wild combinations. Volkov, however, would remain poised and catch Biggie Boy with a straight right, ultimately finishing the fight via TKO just 2 minutes and 12 seconds into the first, earning 13 points. 3 fights to go for Volkov takes us to the 11th of March 2023 for UFC Fight Night Jan vs Derevishvili, where now ranked 8th, Volkov will be put up against number 14th ranked Alexandre Romanov. In a dominant performance, Volkov would capitalize in a Romanov who was quite frankly quite out of shape, as well as using a few cheeky fence grabs on his way to a finish just 2 minutes and 16 seconds into the first via strikes from back control. Volkov will earn 7 points for this fight. 2 fights to go takes us to the 9th of September 2023 for the co-main event of UFC 293 Adesanya vs Strickland, where Volkov, still ranked 8th, would be put up against number 5 ranked Tai Tuivasa. Taking place in Tai's backyard of Sydney, Australia, Volkov would overcome the hostile crowd to shut out Tai, utilising his superior reach to keep Tai at range. Ultimately, Volkov would take Tai down after catching one of Tai's kicks, ending up in a full mount and pulling off a lovely arm triangle into a Zekio choke flow, earning himself 16 points for the victory and an extra 3 points as this is where his finish streak will end. Volkov's last fight takes us to the 22nd of June 2024 for the co-main event of UFC Fight Night Whittaker vs Aliskirov, where Volkov, now ranked 5, would be put up against his former training partner and number 3 ranked Sergey Pavlovich. In another impressive performance for Volkov, he would outclass Sergey for all 3 rounds, landing more volume and damaging strikes, on his way to winning every round on 2 judges' scorecards in a unanimous decision victory. Volkov will earn 18 points for this fight. I kinda forgot how hot Volkov's current streak is, which honestly might be the best current form of any fighter in the heavyweight division outside of Aspinall. But before we make that claim, let's move on to the former interim champ Ciryl Gane, who off the bat gains 5 points as he holds a victory over Volkov. 5 fights ago takes us to the 7th of August 2021 for UFC 265 Lewis vs Gane, where Gane, ranked 3, would be put up against number 2 ranked Derek Lewis for the interim heavyweight belt. In the most Derek Lewis performance ever, minus a knockout on his part, Gane would take advantage of a clear cardio and technical advantage over Lewis, ultimately finishing him via ground and pound 4 minutes and 11 seconds into the third, earning 19 points, as well as an interim championship. 4 fights ago takes us to the 22nd of January 2022 for UFC 270, where Gane, now the interim champion, would look to unify the titles against the champion Francis Ngannou. Gane would get started early, winning the first 2 rounds on the feet, but in a surprising turn of events, Ngannou would show off a huge improvement in his wrestling game, taking the final 3 rounds D1 style. Ultimately, Ngannou would win via unanimous decision and Gane will lose 2 points. 3 fights ago takes us to the 3rd of September 2022 for UFC Fight Night Gane vs Tuivasa, where Gane, now ranked 1, would be put up against number 3 ranked Tai Tuivasa. Taking place in his hometown of Paris, France, Tai and Gane would put on one of the best fights of the year. Tai would actually put Gane out in the second, only for Gane to make a superhuman recovery, get up and rip into Tai with body kicks to almost finish the fight himself. Ultimately, Gane would come back to finish the fight via strikes 4 minutes and 23 seconds into the third, earning 18 points. 2 fights ago takes us to the 4th of March 2023 for UFC 285 Jones vs Gane, where Gane would be put up against John Jones for the heavyweight championship, which is now vacant following Francis Ngannou leaving the UFC. Unfortunately for Gane, he would kinda get steamrolled, with Jones catching him in a guillotine choke just 2 minutes and 4 seconds into the first, losing 3 points for Gane. Gane's last fight takes us to the 2nd of September 2023 for UFC Fight Night Gane vs Spivak, where Gane, ranked 2, will be put up against number 7th ranked Sergey Spivak. In another hometown fight for Gane, he would put in a well-needed bounce-back fight against Sergey. After defending Sergey's initial attempts to get the fight to the ground, Ciryl would dominate every aspect of the fight, ultimately getting the finish 3 minutes and 44 seconds into the second, earning 13 points. So there we have it. MMA Math predicts Ciryl Gane will beat Alexander Volkov again. This is a very close prediction, and really it's their first fight that's the decisive factor. If you recall, Gane dominated their first fight, and it would be pretty hard to see a different result without some major improvements from Volkov. The question for me really is Volkov's current form just a purple patch, or is it indicative of an underlying improvement? In any case, this is a great matchup. Okay, moving on to our co-main event, which, credit where credit is due, Ian Garry is taking on a pretty steep step up in opponent compared to his original slated opponent in Buckley the week after. I have been playing around with the idea of short notice fighters getting a points deduction, but I'm still in the middle of researching how often that actually factually comes into play. For this fight, however, it's not like Garry is coming in untrained. He had a fight slated the week after, and I'm sure his schedule, especially around his weight cut, is going to be messed up a little bit, but I'm willing to ignore it in this instance as both Shavkat and Garry are dealing with the same primary situation, which is a change of opponent. The opening lines in terms of betting odds are not looking too favourable for Garry, but let's see what MMA Math has to say. Starting with Ian Garry, who off the bat will earn 5 points as he is undefeated in his MMA career. 5 fights ago for Garry takes us to the 4th of March 2023 for UFC 285 Jones vs Gane, when unranked Ian Garry would put up against an also unranked Keenan Song. In one of the worst displays of gassing out going for the finish, Song would drop Garry late in the first but entirely blow his load too early. Garry will come back ultimately late in the third, finishing Song after a volley of strikes. 4 minutes and 22 seconds into the third, earning 5.5 points. 4 fights ago takes us to the 13th of May 2023 for UFC Fight Night Rosenstruck vs Almeida, where still unranked Garry will take on his first ranked challenge in 15th ranked Daniel Rodriguez. Garry would pass this test in flying colours, catching Rodriguez just 2 minutes and 57 seconds into the fight with a head kick, and finishing him off with ground strikes, earning 6.5 points and an extra 2 points as this is where his finish streak would end. 3 fights ago takes us to the 19th of August 2023 for UFC 292 Sterling vs O'Malley, where the now ranked 13th Ian Garry would be put up against 11th ranked Neil Magny. In what is, in my opinion, Garry's breakout performance, Garry would dominate the veteran bell to bell in virtually every aspect of the fight. Garry would win every round on every judge's scorecard, with one judge even scoring every round a 10-8. Garry would earn 10 points for this victory. 2 fights ago for Garry takes us to the 17th of February 2024 for UFC 298 Volkanovski vs Topuria, where the now 10th ranked Garry would be put up against number 8th ranked Jeff Neal. In one of Garry's more uninspiring performances, Neal would pressure him the entire fight, with Garry's longer range weapons keeping the distance. Ultimately, not a lot of note happened in this fight, and Garry would be given the victory via split decision, earning himself 8 points. Garry's last fight takes us to the 29th of June 2024 for UFC 303 Pereira vs Prohaska 2, where Garry, now ranked 7th, would be put up against 14th ranked Michael Venom Page. In a turn of form for Garry, he would rely on his wrestling and grappling to attempt to neutralize MVP's striking game. Ultimately, the fight would present the age-old question of whether damage on the feet or control on the ground are more valuable to the judges. It would be Garry's control that would get the nudge in this fight, earning him a relatively controversial but probably correct unanimous decision, earning 2 points. Moving on to Shavkat, who genuinely might be one of the more exciting guys currently in the UFC. Not only is he undefeated in his MMA career, earning him 5 points, but also throughout his career he has never gone to a decision, which is a bit mental in an 18-fight professional career. 5 fights ago for Shavkat takes us to the 26th of June 2021 for, funnily enough, the first Volkov vs Gane fight, where now in his second UFC fight, an unranked Shavkat would be put up against MMA veteran but also unranked Mikel Prazeres. Mikel was able to pose a few challenges in the first round to Shavkat, but ultimately Shavkat would solve these puzzles quickly, finishing Mikel via rear naked choke 2 minutes and 10 seconds into the second, becoming the first fighter in 28 fights to finish Mikel, earning 5.5 points. 4 fights ago takes us to the 5th of February 2022 for UFC Fight Night Hermansson vs Strickland, where a still unranked Shavkat would be put up against an also unranked Carlston Harris. In a fight that helped put Shavkat on the map, he would dominate every aspect of the fight on his way to hitting a beautiful spinning heel kick, finishing the fight shortly after with ground strikes, earning 5.5 points. 3 fights ago takes us to the 25th of June 2022 for UFC Fight Night Saryukian vs Gamrot, where a now 15th ranked Shavkat would be put up against number 10 ranked Neil Magny. In yet another dominant performance for Shavkat, he would utilize his grappling to control a large majority of this fight, ultimately catching a cheeky guillotine with just 2 seconds remaining in the second round, earning 11 points. 2 fights ago takes us to the 4th of March 2023 for UFC 285 Jones vs Gane, where Shavkat, now ranked 9, would be put up against 7th ranked Jeff Neal. After missing weight, Neal would provide Shavkat with his biggest challenge, being stubborn in both the stand-up and grappling over the first 2 rounds. Shavkat, however, would figure it out in the third, hurting Neal with strikes and finishing him with a standing rear naked choke 4 minutes and 17 seconds into the third, earning 14 points. Shavkat's last fight takes us to UFC 296 Edwards vs Covington, where Shavkat, now ranked 5, would be put up against arguably his biggest challenge on paper, number 6th ranked Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. In yet another dominant performance for Shavkat, after showing off his dominant grappling in the first, he would catch Wonderboy in a rear naked choke midway through the second, which Wonderboy would somehow wiggle his way out of, only to be caught in another rear naked choke at the end of the round, 4 minutes and 56 seconds into the second, earning 15 points for the victory and another incredible 5 points for the finish streak he takes into this fight. And there we have it. MMA Math predicts Shavkat to beat Ian Garry in a probably predictable decision. Based on the eye test, it's hard to disagree with this, but the unknown here is how Shavkat handles any adversity in the cage. However, there really isn't anything to suggest he won't be able to handle it like a champion, and if Ian Garry is really the one to pose those questions, I'm not too sure. So with those 2 fights out of the way, let's look at the main event for the flyweight title between Pantoja vs Asakura. As I said before, we won't be doing a full breakdown of this fight, but looking at 2 common opponents and doing an unofficial off-the-record talk/prediction. I would also recommend checking out my video on Kai Asakura's relevance to the UFC if you haven't already. So the first fighter that both Pantoja and Asakura share is Yuka Sasaki, who fought both fighters within a 12-month span. Both Pantoja and Asakura beat him in the first round, Pantoja by submission and Asakura via breaking his jaw with a right hook. There isn't too much to bring up with these performances, especially as both fights just ended really quickly. However, the common opponent of most relevance here is Manuel Kape, who Asakura fought twice, winning once and losing once, and who Pantoja fought once and beat. From an MMA math perspective, this is where we have to make the unofficial prediction that Pantoja will beat Asakura based on their performances against Kape. In Asakura's first fight against Kape, we got a seriously fun fight that was extremely close and honestly probably should have gone to Kape. Asakura hit Kape with a vicious, unintentional eye poke in this fight, which if we're being objective, probably should have been a point deduction. In any case, they would rematch a year and a half later and Kape would finish Asakura. Pantoja, however, would beat Kape in a close but convincing fashion, pressuring him the entire fight and defending takedown attempts easily. Ultimately using the common opponent test, Pantoja should take this one, but as we all know, it's far more complicated than this, and thus we aren't going to make this an official prediction. Thanks as always to everyone who made it this far into the video. Let me know in the comments if you agree with these predictions. Make sure to like the video if you like the video and check out the other content on your screen.